Hello friends, my name is JJ. So today I just felt like doing a more personal video on a topic I have been thinking a lot about lately, which is how things have changed. For those who don't know, I am 36 years old, which means I was born in 1984 and grew up in the late 80s and early 90s. Does that seem like a long time ago to you? It is definitely starting to feel like a long time ago to me, but not in a bad way. Getting older brings all sorts of challenges and anxieties, but one of the cool things about it is that it also allows you to more confidently view yourself as being part of history as your lifetime starts to overlap with more and more of it. Now, when we talk about the big historical changes that people of my generation have experienced, the tendency is to focus on technological change, which has indeed been tremendous. So tremendous, in fact, that I think I will leave that topic for a whole other video. Instead, today I wanted to talk about changes to society, because I think that that topic tends to be a little bit less remarked upon by people of my generation. There is often a thinking that significant social change is mostly something that happened in the old days and is something that people in their 60s or 70s or 80s can reflect on, but not people in their 30s like me. But as I get closer to middle age, I feel more and more aware of the many ways in which the world of the 2020s is in fact quite noticeably different in terms of values and stigmas and customs and norms than it was back in my day. So allow me to reminisce. Just one necessary prefix, of course. In addition to being a child of the 1980s, I am also a white, male, middle-class Canadian, and my experiences will obviously reflect that. I would never claim that the way the world has changed from my perspective necessarily reflects the most important changes, just that they are the most obvious to me. And on that note, the first social change we're going to talk about is one that is particularly obvious to me, which is attitudes towards homosexuality. In case you didn't know, I am a homosexual person myself, so the evolution of how the culture around me has treated homosexuality is something I have paid a fair bit of attention to. So when I was a kid, the whole concept of gay people was still this very awkward and uncomfortable subject for adults. It was certainly something that my teachers at school never explained in any serious way. We were taught not to be racist or prejudiced, just like the kids are now, but this idea of homophobia as a specific social ill was not a mainstream thing back in the 1990s. A byproduct of this is that I really didn't grow up with a clear understanding of what being gay or homosexual even was. Those words were even considered sort of bad and dirty, and kids would use them as insults. I even had some teachers who in retrospect were fairly openly homophobic. When I was in high school, there would be some male teachers who were kind of effeminate and the kids would make fun of them, and sometimes the other teachers would join in too. There were certainly no openly gay teachers or kids, and none of the authority figures in any of the schools I went to ever really treated the idea of creating a LGBT-friendly space as an issue of any real importance. In the media of that time, meanwhile, when you did see gay people, they were often portrayed as either being extremely eccentric and flamboyant, like Elton John, or kind of twisted and perverted, like Smithers in The Simpsons, or sort of radical and avant-garde, like Sven Robinson. Sven Robinson is a person most of you have probably never heard of, but for a long time he was the only openly gay member of the Canadian Parliament, and also one of its most extreme left-wing members. This sort of thing in turn added to a lot of the confusion for gay people of my generation. This idea that, we couldn't possibly be gay because gay people were this very extreme and strange sort of person, whereas we were, normal. On that front, a very significant thing for me was watching the 90s era sitcom Spin City, which had a gay character named Carter, who kind of opened my eyes about what homosexuality actually was. Carter was an out gay man, and even though he was often bullied or teased by the other characters for being gay, he was also portrayed as being a basically normal person, except that he dated men instead of women. At the time, TV characters like Carter were often considered controversial because of the way they normalized homosexuality, which I guess was true because he certainly helped normalize it for me. Anyway, by the time I got to college in the early 2000s, it was clear that things were changing. By that point, I knew that I was gay and I was relatively open about it, and it wasn't that big of a deal to anyone. This was also around the time that the big global debate over gay marriage really took off, which kind of marked the definitive end of anybody's ability to treat the existence of homosexual people as this big taboo. Today, of course, there are still people with anti-gay attitudes all across this continent, But what is really remarkable to me is just how vastly more accepting our culture is overall. The thing I always find myself coming back to is just the fact that kids today are given so much more accurate, neutral information about what being gay means than they ever were in my day, and just how much confusion and even trauma that must spare them as a result. On a related note, let us now talk about changing norms of offensiveness. This one is really interesting to me because I feel like I grew up at a time when worrying about offensive things was a big part of the culture, but also a time when the standards of offensiveness were really quite different from what they are today. Perhaps the best example is The Simpsons. The Simpsons was this hugely controversial show when I was a kid, and many people of my generation will have memories of either not being allowed to watch it, or at least having friends whose parents wouldn't allow them to watch it. What is particularly quaint about this is that the maximum controversy over The Simpsons occurred during its earliest seasons, which, as I discussed in a recent award-winning video, were also the show's most square and conservative years. A time when every episode of the show went out of its way to have morals and a happy ending and all of that. But in those days, a lot of parents were very worried about aspects of the show that seem very strange to be bothered by now, like Bart being disrespectful, or Homer being a bad father. Disrespect, in particular, is a kind of strange sin we don't really think about much these days. I remember there was this Super Nintendo basketball game called NBA Jam, and if you entered a secret code, you could play as President Clinton. This was considered very thrillingly naughty to us kids at the time, and it was controversial with some adults because of how disrespectful to the president it was. So check out this old newspaper article I vividly remember reading as a kid. It is from the Globe and Mail, April 3rd, 1993, and it complains about the Saturday morning hell, which is kids' television, which the author describes using language like disturbing, horrific, militaristic violence, and extreme sexism. And just to be clear, she is specifically talking about the shows Ninja Turtles, Darkwing Duck, and Tiny Toons. There was a similar moral panic at the same time over this game, Mortal Kombat for the Sega Genesis, which was considered like the most impossibly horrifically violent thing anyone had ever seen before. And it led to video games getting those little alphabet content warning stickers on them. So the point is, when I look at the kind of stuff that kids today consume very casually, it can sometimes be kind of shocking. TV is undoubtedly much ruder and cruder, and video games are much more realistically violent, but at some point it seems like the critics just stopped caring. Like, I know I certainly stopped caring at some point. Sometimes I'll be watching a movie with a bunch of kids in the audience, and there will be some incredibly gory or violent scene, and I'll just be like, and then only later will I think like, that scene probably would have made people literally explode with shock and outrage 30 years ago. One thing that will never stop being weird to me, however, is all of these poop-themed toys that they sell these days. Poop plushies and poop board games and poop floaties for the pool, even poop candies. When I was young, poop was like the ultimate taboo. Even the grossest gross-out show in the world would never so much as talk about it. But now there's a whole line of poop dollies, so I guess that battle was lost. Now clearly today we still live in a world where rooting out and condemning offensive stuff continues to consume a lot of people's time and attention, and it often has the same sort of moralizing busybody character as it did when I was a kid. But the big shift has been a swing towards getting offended over stuff that is considered hurtful to the identities of specific groups of people, as opposed to stuff that is considered morally corrosive in a more collective, societal way, like violence or rudeness. And now the last big social change I want to talk about is what I would call the changing nature of adult lifestyles. In many ways, this is the changing social norm you become most aware of as you get older, particularly once you are as old as your parents were when they had you. It's a very interesting psychological turning point, the moment at which you realize that you are now older than most of the adult authority figures from your childhood. Now, some of the changing expectations of adulthood are pretty consistent over time. People tend to start having families progressively later, so it's not that surprising that I have friends who are only getting married or having kids in their mid-30s when their grandparents would have done so in their early 20s. But some of the other differences are a bit more striking and unexpected. Like, for example, the way that adults look these days. When I was young, there was a much starker difference between how adults dressed and how kids or teenagers dressed. Adults didn't wear t-shirts very much, for instance. Even if you look at a photo of super casual young adults hanging out in like the late 80s or early 90s, like say this photo of the Simpsons writer's room from 1992, you can see that pretty much everybody's wearing a collared shirt of some form. Or watch a show like Seinfeld or even Friends and notice how rarely any of the 30-year-old characters wear a t-shirt in that. I remember when I was in high school, we once had this very young student teacher come in and he was wearing a t-shirt, and I thought that that was a kind of edgy thing for a teacher to be doing. The degree that tattoos have become common is another big thing. I have very strong memories of always being sort of scared and excited when I saw a person with tattoos as a child, because in those days, having tattoos was still considered a sign that you were some sort of real tough guy, like a biker or an ex-con. But of course, now every random guy at the coffee shop has those full sleeves, and it's just as likely to be taken as a sign that you're arty and thoughtful as thuggish and tough. The distinction between youth and adult hobbies has also become a lot more blurred than it used to be. When I was little, I had this friend named Oliver, whose house I would often visit. And whenever I was there, his dad was always playing PC games in his study. And even though he'd be playing these lame grown-up games like Flight Simulator, it still struck me and my parents as an odd thing for an adult to be doing, since back then the stereotype was that computer games were basically toys and only kids cared about them. Today I'd be curious if any of my younger viewers have dads who play video games, because certainly every dad that I know does. Thinking about Oliver's dad, I'm also reminded that he smoked a lot in the house, but a lot of adults smoked indoors in those days. My parents would always have an ashtray on the table for when their smoker friends came by. And going to restaurants as a kid, I very much remember that the first question the host would always ask would be smoking or non-smoking. The smell of tobacco in restaurants or hotels or grown-up houses is one of my dominant childhood sense memories to this day. It's really quite remarkable the degree to which indoor smoking has been almost completely eradicated from modern society, which is in large part due to the fact that my generation was so successfully propagandized against smoking in general. But anyway, those are just a few examples of how society has changed in my lifetime. I'm really excited to hear how you think that social values have changed within your lifetimes. Give me some personal anecdotes or examples in the comments below, and I will see you next week.